Because of past promises that were not fulfilled, we find it hard to trust future promises. What can help us have faith and confidence to depend on important promises that shape our lives? Although Abraham and Sarah had to wait a long time for God's promise of a son to be born to them to shape all people of the earth, God showed them that this promise was trustworthy. Our text for this lesson is a small snapshot of a much larger narrative surrounding God, Abram, and Sarah. Amid concerns about having no son to whom to leave his vast estate upon his death, Abraham, then known as Abram, receives a promise from God in Genesis 15 that he would not have to leave his inheritance to a servant in his home, but to an heir of his own flesh and blood. Though Abram was well into his 80s when God promises him a son, God's track record with Abram stabilized his faith for God to do seemingly unthinkable. The Bible reveals Abram believed the Lord for an heir to be born. As time continues, Sarah, or Sarai at the time, seeks to help God, assuming she is too old to produce the son of the promise that Abram anticipates. Sarai gives her servant Hagar to Abram to become his mate and the future mother of Abram's firstborn, Ishmael, at the ripe old age of 86. It is not long before the tension arises between the two women of the house. Sarai deals harshly with her servant Hagar and regrets allowing her to bear Abram's son. This brings us to our key Bible verse for today, which reads, "The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised." Genesis chapter 21, verse 1. As Sarah listens to Abram and the visitors discuss the miracle that will occur through her womb, she is tickled by the prospect. It has been about 13 years since the birth of Ishmael. Sarah has been barren her entire life and is now approaching 90 years old. How crazy must this visitor be to believe Sarah would give birth to a child a year from now? Afraid to blow her cover, Sarah laughs silently to herself. For Sarah, a feat like this is doubtful, and her statement presents at least two sources of doubt. The first is her perceived internal barriers to the possibility. The text identifies Sarah as a very old, very beyond childbearing years, and she even sees herself as a worn out woman. She has not had any success in bearing children in the past 89 years, so what would change this now? Certainly, childbearing was a young woman's game, not the work of one well into her 80s. In short, if it could have happened through her, Sarah surmises it would have already occurred. Moreover, Sarah also doubts the external resources she has to get the job done, namely her 99-year-old husband Abraham. In Sarah's mind, this idea of childbirth is especially laughable when my master, my husband, is also so old. Yet her statement gives us a clue that the idea, though unlikely, is a favorable one for her, as she would like to bear a child but just does not know if it is possible. So when we pick up on the story again in Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 7, we find a temporary yet appropriate bookend for the narrative around Abram, Sarah, and the birth of their son Isaac. God is faithful to the promise he makes to Abraham. And Sarah gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. This happened at just the time God said it would. This is a fantastic feat, one that leaves both Abraham and Sarah grateful and relieved. Appropriately, in the face of God's faithfulness, Abraham is moved to obedience and has Isaac circumcised on the 8th day as God commanded. Abraham is grateful for the faithfulness of God, one who keeps even the most fantastic of promises. As a result, Abraham is committed to being faithful and obedient to God in return, handling the blessing and promise in the way God had instructed him. Here's our lesson. While some of what God speaks to us may seem laughable, it is not impossible. This text reminds us of God's nature to keep his promises. Be mindful and watchful for God to confirm what he has spoken to you. When God makes good on his promises to us, it is important to show our appreciation by handling the blessing in the way God has instructed us. In many ways, obedience is the best thank you we can provide to God when he does the fantastic in our lives. Thank you so much for listening and subscribing to iLights. Heavenly Father, fill our hearts with what we truly desire, for who we truly seek is you.